Story 1. It sounded like a problem for several months. I didn't think it would ever be an issue anywhere else. Story 2. I thought it was just another flu outbreak, and even if it wasn't, I believed it would go away in a few months. There was a similar type of virus called severe acute respiratory syndrome, which is similar to the virus strain causing COVID-19. The first strain had a higher mortality rate but was less easy to transmit. It went away in about half a year. I didn't expect COVID to persist for over 5 years. Story 3. It was a big joke at first. Some students at a college in Albany threw a COVID party in February 2020 and were suspended for anti-Asian hate. 3 weeks later, the National Basketball Association was canceled. That's when we realized it was serious. Story 4. It was going to mutate and it was serious. I was working in a daycare at the time and knew I would catch it. I think I did before the test became available and almost died while the emergency room brushed off my 104-degree fever, 160 heart rate, and my nearly fainting in the lobby, along with my constant complaints about feeling something strange in my chest. They sent me home, and I could tell from their faces that they were worried, but they didn't want me there. Story 5. I heard about something happening in China in November 2019, and I knew something was afoot. I didn't expect a full global lockdown. Story 6. The first time I heard about it, it was only in Wuhan. I thought, new viruses pop up all the time. There was avian flu, bird flu, and those are only the larger ones. Then there are hundreds of others no one has heard about. This is going to settle in a month or two. When I heard about the cases in Italy, I thought, well, if it spreads to Italy, nothing is stopping it from spreading to Germany. I bought 10 surgical masks for my family, and the pharmacists looked at me like I was a crazy person. 5 days later, they were sold out everywhere. Interestingly, the virus variant that went global was traced back to Italy, suggesting that's where the virus mutated and became much more transmissible for the first time. I know it's a sensitive topic and people interpret things differently, so I want to clarify. I'm not blaming or implying anything. I just find it interesting to know, since it's well known for other variants, but somehow not for that one, which didn't even have a proper name, D614G. Story 7. As the person who sourced 80% of the nasopharyngeal swabs into the country through Quest Diagnostics from our Chinese supplier, I knew we were in trouble. Story 8. I was in Chicago when I saw information on Twitter about China building 3 hospitals in a week, and then thought, well, that seems bad. It was bad. Story 9. I didn't think anything of it. It didn't finally set in until the National Basketball Association canceled a game right before it was about to start. Story 10. I told my friends and family that it was going to go global, last for a minimum of 2 years, and that they should stock up on essentials. I also mentioned that at least 30% of people would row in the opposite direction and bail water into the boat, though I never imagined how unfortunately right I would be about that. Story 11. I remember listening to a podcast where the host, who was quite emphatic, mentioned it in the context of stocking up on non-perishables when Wuhan first went into lockdown. I thought something along the lines of, this will be a huge nothing that will never affect us. It is certainly one of the biggest mistakes I have ever made in judgment. Story 12. I may have been one of the first people in the contiguous United States to get it. I can't prove it, but the circumstances make a lot of sense. I took time off to visit family in San Antonio during the holidays in 2019. After the new year, it was time for us to return home to Houston. The day we were headed back, I felt unwell, and my wife had to take over driving duties for the 3.5-hour, 180-mile trip. The next day, I thought I felt a little better, so I went to work. However, I deteriorated quickly, so I decided to go home and noticed that I was spiking a fever of 103 degrees Fahrenheit. Thinking it was a simple bug, I stayed home to rest. Turns out I was wrong, and it was a severe bug that lasted 3 days. The fever stayed fairly constant at 103 degrees Fahrenheit. On the second day, I went to the doctor to get checked, and they tested me for both common strains of influenza and some other conditions. The tests came back negative. I was told it was probably just a bug and I would recover on my own. Luckily, my immune system was healthy, and I recovered fully. But then the news of COVID-19 started to emerge. Interestingly, I was one of the first in the United States to hear about it. thanks to my Malaysian coworker who read the Chinese headlines. My anxious mind started to distrust everyone around me, which, in retrospect, was probably a good instinct. I warned my family about the impending wave of shutdowns and the pandemic. They thought I was being irrational. Well into the pandemic is when I started to connect the dots. I felt sick and experienced COVID-like symptoms, but where did it come from? At the beginning of December 2019, my sister had taken a trip to Hawaii to attend a reggae festival, and she felt unwell when she returned. She also went to the doctor, but they couldn't detect what she had. If we assume she had COVID-19, where would she have contracted it in Hawaii? Turns out that many Chinese nationals, some from Wuhan, enjoy vacationing in Hawaii. Thus, my theory is as follows. A citizen from Wuhan caught the virus 2 weeks prior, then went on vacation to Hawaii. They attended the same reggae festival that my sister went to and possibly spread it in the air. She unwittingly caught the virus and then returned home to San Antonio, where she felt unwell and began to spread it to our family. When I came to visit, I interacted with her, ended up catching the virus, and then deteriorated at home. It's pretty remarkable. I'm just glad I was responsible and didn't visit crowded places in Houston while ill. As soon as I realized how unwell I felt, I stayed home and tried to limit contact with others. This was before the ideas of masks and sanitation became widespread. If only more people who were ill had done the same, maybe the pandemic could have been mitigated. Alas, we will never know. Story 13. My foot doctor said it was going to be really bad in the first week. I thought, no way. It turns out his girlfriend was a type of scientist specializing in biology and germs. She was right. Story 14. Oh, another serious issue in China that they will have to deal with. It wasn't until February when a friend from Taiwan urged me to buy masks that I realized something serious was happening. I looked to buy masks online, and they were all sold out. Story 15. I didn't think much of it until our roommates came home and informed us that the shelves at the store were empty. That actually struck fear in me. A few days later, work required us to pack up our desktops and work from home. Story 16. Oh no, this is going to be difficult. My family said I was making a big deal out of nothing, but I was sure that this would be significant. Story 17. I began to feel worried early on, mainly because my mother had to shorten her annual trip to visit her parents in Hangzhou as a precaution. Story 18. I remember hearing about it maybe a month before lockdown started, and we didn't pay too much attention, thinking it was the usual doom-mongering. Then our job told us all to prepare for working from home. I remember when the lockdown started, and we thought maybe 2 weeks and we would be back in. The first time I actually thought this was serious was the week after the lockdown started. It was a Thursday in my country. I went to the local corner shop, and they had all these social distancing signs. They had rearranged the shop so the queue system snaked all the way around. They also had plexiglass screens behind the counter. I vividly remember queuing up and thinking this is actually real and that we could be in this for the long haul. Story 19. I thought to myself, here we go. This is the big one. We are in trouble. To be fair, I had similar thoughts about severe acute respiratory syndrome several times before and for other outbreaks, so it doesn't mean much that I was mostly correct about COVID-19. Story 20. I bought gold and informed everyone close to me to prepare for a global crisis. Nobody listened. I was able to say, I told you so a few months later. Story 21. The first time I didn't worry much because it was far away. When it started spreading in Europe, I became concerned, especially due to the attitude of people thinking it wouldn't reach our country. When the first cases were discovered here, I thought it would take at least a year to get under control. My husband was more optimistic and became more disillusioned when lockdowns and other measures were implemented. Story 22. I read about it in early November. I thought, man, this is going to disrupt shipping through China. Boy, was I right. Story 23. The first time I heard of it, it was still in China, and I considered it a localized outbreak, similar to Ebola outbreaks in Africa. My attention increased when the first cases appeared in the United States. Story 24. This was my honest reaction. I was watching the news with my family. They ran a story about a new flu emerging from China. I turned to my wife and said, Here comes the panic. Mass hysteria is a real phenomenon. The COVID-19 pandemic is a great example of it. A man is smart. People are foolish. Charles Manson. Story 25. I thought once you get it, you basically had 4 days to live. I remember when it hit the news that Tom Hanks had it, and he made a video statement. I kind of thought I was watching his last words. Story 26. I thought it would be like notifications of bird and swine flu that you often hear from China and other Southeast Asian countries. Reasonably harmless and contained. I remember watching increasingly dire news reports as it progressed, and when it got to the point of China spraying streets with disinfectant and welding people into apartments, the news of it being detected in other countries really made it hit home. Story 27. I was living in Japan, not paying attention to world news when I was talking with someone in the United States. They asked me what was going on with the virus. I had no idea what they were referring to. Japan never implemented a lockdown and had very few precautions in place, so I did not really concern myself with it. Story 28. I thought about everything like a walking death or a virus that managed to escape from a Chinese laboratory, and I guess I wasn't all that wrong with my second guess. Story 29. I was in therapy for health anxiety and panic disorder. I struggled with going out and obsessing over every little twinge. My therapist said there was no point in continuing because I wasn't able to test myself, as everything was closed and I shouldn't be going out. Honestly, my mental health improved significantly. I was already skilled at not making plans and isolating, so ironically I ventured out more than before and got fit during our isolated walks. Story 30. I was sitting at a bar eating lunch when the news came on about the virus spreading in China. Felt cinematic. I remember thinking this might be significant. What an understatement. Story 31. I was at a surgical center for rotator cuff surgery 2 weeks before it happened. The nurses were anxious about something. Story 32. I was in an international airport, and it wasn't the first time in my life that there had been a scare like this. I remember swine flu, mad cow disease, and bird flu. This certainly felt a little different, but it was still very new, and no one knew anything. I did get sick a day later, but I still don't think it was COVID-19. By late February, I was starting to get worried. By March, when shutdowns happened, I knew it was a big deal that needed to be taken seriously. Story 33. I thought it was interesting, just like the Black Death, it is a plague brought into Europe from China by Italian merchants. Story 34. I thought it would be the same for us Europeans as bird flu, just a flash in the pan. Actually, during the stages where it was really taking hold, I was amazed by the racism from our leaders. Of course, that's the Italians for you. We will fare much better. Story 35. Having lived through other periods of hyped newsworthy viruses such as avian influenza, swine influenza, bovine spongiform encephalopathy, Ebola, Middle East respiratory syndrome, and severe acute respiratory syndrome, I initially did not think much of it. This was before people started dying, and morgues around the world began to run out of space. Story 36. I thought it was just something happening somewhere. I went on vacation for 2 weeks, and when I came back, the entire airport was wearing mouth guards. Story 37. I was annoyed that the Australian government was slow to allow Chinese people into the country when the scare first occurred. Story 38. I didn't really know what to think. It felt like constant fear-mongering. It was surprising to see how little traffic there was on the motorway. People were queuing single file and spaced apart outside of stores. I couldn't understand how there weren't riots when it was revealed that a previous government was having garden parties while regular people were not allowed to visit their dying loved ones in the hospital. Story 39. I was in India on business. My wife, who is a physician and a former molecular scientist, biodefense vaccine researcher, and immunology professor, called me to tell me about it. She reviewed the sequences with her former colleagues and informed me that the situation is going to worsen before it improves. When ports started shutting down, I was afraid I wouldn't be coming home. After 2 weeks in India, I was ready to return. The first confirmed case of COVID-19 in the United States was in Seattle on January 20th, 2020. She believes she had it weeks earlier while working in an urgent care facility in Virginia. At that time, she thought she was treating a severe respiratory virus that was circulating. How right she was. Story 40. This is going to be a problem. I was working for a company that, in January and February, had significant operations in China. My shifts began to be canceled due to the lack of work. I followed an epidemiologist on YouTube who provided accurate insights. We had vacations planned for early and late January, and we were glad we took them. After that, things took a turn. I thought if we shut down the world from March to May, we would be in a good position afterward. Story 41. I was watching videos of people in China being ill in the streets and thought if this crosses the ocean, we are in trouble. I am not an alarmist, but that had me concerned. Everyone around me did not believe me. Story 42. I hoped that flights to and from China would be canceled before the Chinese New Year. Story 43. I thought I would last a weekend, maybe a week. I still remember people jumping over each other to buy sandwich bread during the first few days. Then the toilet paper hoarders came. I was supposed to start spring break 2 weeks after quarantine began. They just said, "Forget it. We're going on break early." That 2-week break turned into 2 years. March 2020 to August 2022 did not exist. Story 44. Honestly, I first heard about it from the outbreaks on cruise ships in Japan and from various descriptions based on my education. I was scared it would turn into a global pandemic that would take several years to recover from. When I saw the reports from Italy, I thought we were facing a crippled healthcare system. Fun fact, the government was in contact with large gyms, planning to use their tennis courts as makeshift mortuaries in case the mortality rate of the virus was really high. Story 45. I saw the hard closure of Wuhan on Twitter, went to Costco that weekend, and made a large purchase of supplies. Story 46. I was at a convenience store and heard a pair of guys commenting on how it looked like a zombie apocalypse. Story 47. I feel like my region is overprepared, but I still follow the policy. Proved that my nation was right. Story 48. And the thing is, we thought it was going to absolutely destroy human civilization, but nowadays it seems that never happened. Story 49. I was certain we were facing a global problem. I might have imagined it worse than it was. I remember hearing about it in late 2019 and feeling angry that the news was not addressing the story at all. I believe the media could have warned us in the United States and instead completely failed us. Story 50. I got fired a week before it really got bad. I took the first job I could find that was already remote. Story 51. My initial reaction was similar to previous panics like SARS and swine flu. I thought it sounded scary but assumed it would pass quickly like those did. However, once I saw other countries locking down and restricting travel, I knew the situation was different. Story 52. The first time I heard of it was on Reddit, where someone posted a video of a hospital in China that was under military lockdown. There were rumors of people being sick there, but seeing that video was frightening, knowing whatever it was would likely spread. Story 53. I thought that for 2 weeks we would be working from home, playing Animal Crossing, watching Tiger King, and ordering pizzas. Then we would return to life as usual. I had no idea that the pandemic would be so severe, politicized, and weaponized. It highlighted how fragile our systems are and how foolish we can be as a species. Story 54. My initial thought was that it would blow over fairly quickly like bird flu and swine flu before it. However, about a month or two later, I realized the situation was much worse than anticipated. Story 55. That is unfortunate. I hope everyone is okay. Fast forward 5 years after 5 bouts of COVID-19 and 1 case of long COVID-19. Oh no. Story 56. I was mostly afraid for my parents. I was just afraid that they would die. Story 57. I was watching the news when it first emerged in China and became a full-blown alert. It was pretty scary, as I have a chronic illness that is managed but makes me vulnerable. Once the lockdown began, I felt better about the situation. Story 58. I was studying pandemics at the time while also working in private practice as a pulmonologist. When I read the first reports of outbreaks in China, I told the doctor that I had a feeling it would become significant. He disagreed. I should have placed a bet on it. Story 59. It's just another flu. People are making a big deal out of it because of the fear of the unknown. but it's basically the same thing we have every year. Oh boy, did that age poorly. Story 60. Work in healthcare and compared it to the cooties because of how overhyped every superbug has been for the most part. Story 61. I contracted COVID-19 before it was officially acknowledged in America. I searched online for information on what to do if you have COVID-19, but there were no recommendations available. I ended up just suffering in bed. As a result, I quit smoking because my lungs feel too precious now. Story 62. I wonder how bad a virus could really be. I don't have much perspective on these matters. Story 63. I played enough Pandemic to know that if we are only hearing about it now, it has probably been active for a couple of weeks, and we could have a real problem on our hands if we do not treat this like the global issue it will be in the coming months. I received a call 3 days later on Friday that the gig I was supposed to start on Monday had been indefinitely paused. Story 64. My boss returned from a several-month trip to India and China for medical conferences just before the lockdown. Then, half of us caught a severe flu for 2 to 3 weeks. This was before testing was available. I honestly think she might have brought it back to us. Story 65. The first time I heard of it was when a typically cautious colleague bought packets of masks, even before lockdowns were mentioned. We joked in the office about how absurdly paranoid he was being. Turned out he was actually right for once. I suppose even a broken clock is right twice a day. Story 66. When I first heard, I didn't think much of it. It might be bad locally like SARS or MERS, but I thought it would blow over or burn out like they did. However, when my colleagues and I, who are microbiologists and epidemiologists, received the first reliable numbers out of China and ran the calculations, I became very concerned. Those numbers indicated over 3 million deaths in the first year in the United States. I still remember that day. It haunts me. I ended up losing 1 family member and 2 friends to it. Story 67. I did not think much about it until I heard that China was locking down entire cities. I had never heard of that happening before and began to consider that it might be something serious. Story 68. I remembered the swine flu outbreak in 2009 and how effectively it was handled. At the time, I didn't think it would become such a significant issue. Story 69. I felt the same way about any multi-country infectious disease throughout my 26 years of life, such as SARS, Ebola, and Zika virus. I thought there were only a few isolated cases in major hospitals in the United States, originating from the countries where the diseases started, and that it would be contained quickly. It wasn't until April 2020 when our emergency room director informed the entire department, including me, that 70% of the world is likely to get this new COVID-19 virus, that I realized this situation was going to be very serious. Story 70. Did not do much. Knew it was only a matter of time before someone brought it home and shared it with the rest of us. Story 71. I thought my mom was starting a new conspiracy theory, which she occasionally does, but nothing to that extent. She was discussing it a lot in November before the shutdown, so when it turned out to be true, the rest of my family was shocked but prepared. Story 72. I didn't think much of it until we received an email from my school describing a disruption in daily life. I knew things were about to change when they extended our spring break from 1 week to 2. They called us back for 2 days afterward and then sent us home for the rest of the year. Story 73. It was on the news that 2 Chinese tower blocks had locked everyone in their apartments. The buildings were opening their windows and howling to each other as a sign of solidarity. It scared me and felt apocalyptic. Story 74. I treated it like Ebola and other diseases. It didn't grab my attention until I saw all the posts from Italy where people were begging for help. I vividly remember seeing a video of a man whose sister died in her bed. They were roommates and no one would come to collect the body. Story 75. Okay. Let's postpone the work trip by a month. About 10 of us were planning to travel to an office in Asia. The destination itself did not have any outbreaks, but the transit hubs such as Tokyo and Hong Kong did. Story 76. Late 2019 was when I started to worry. It didn't seem like business as usual. I was talking to my then boss, saying we should be ready to switch rapidly to working from home. We did this a week before things started to go awry in our country. Story 77. I heard about it very early on. I told my family about it and that this one had me concerned for everyone. I was laughed at. Story 78. I thought it would be like SARS from a decade earlier. Within a couple of weeks, it was clear to me this was a different situation entirely. Unfortunately, the former president delayed action, and many of his supporters never realized the seriousness in time before it became a major issue. Story 79. My wife was in the hospital for surgery at the end of January 2020. I had just heard about COVID-19, but I wasn't very worried at the time. Her surgery went well. Neither of us contracted the virus until mid-2022 when I got it while waiting in line to get tested for COVID-19. Story 80. I thought it would be like bird flu and mostly not a big deal. Then I saw hospitals being built in a week, and I realized the severity of the situation. Story 81. I was in Beijing when it started and really thought it would be nothing, that it would just fade away after about a month. I had actually planned to go to Wuhan for the Chinese New Year holiday. My boss asked me not to, and at first I thought, I'll still go. No big deal. Later, she asked again, and since I knew I had coworkers with new babies at home who were worried, I canceled for their peace of mind. It's good I did, or I would have been stranded in a hotel in Wuhan for months. I helped create one of the first English-language public health publications explaining what coronavirus disease is and how to avoid getting it. We finished when it was still called Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome Coronavirus 2. If anyone would like to see it, I have scans of it. Story 82. Oh, that sounds serious for the few people affected. Anyway, it was just another flu-like disease mentioned in the news about another part of the world, which happens every year. It wasn't anything to consider until it suddenly escalated, leading to school closures. Story 83. I was still in school back then and really wanted a vacation, so when the country announced a 10-day holiday to contain a spreading disease, I was actually kind of excited. Story 84. Based on the information we were given at the time, we all thought this was the end. It is airborne and highly contagious. If you are near someone with it, you will become infected. First, it was quite interesting. There were scattered reports of a mystery epidemic in China. Then it moved to the United States, then to Europe, and finally landed in the United Kingdom. We weren't that concerned at this point because people were just experiencing flu symptoms, and those affected were up north. We are about as far south as you can get. Then it arrived in London, and there were reports of people dying. Soon, there were numerous reports of fatalities. It quickly escalated into a full-blown pandemic. Stay inside, do not mix with people outside your small family group, or you will face severe consequences. At this point, I ran out of food and had to venture to the supermarket. There is nothing like a contagious airborne pathogen to make you notice how much people are breathing and coughing on your food. It was horrific. Bear in mind, there was no cure and no vaccine. The official guidance was clear. If you catch it, you face dire consequences. I ended up discarding my shopping list and only picked up items I could scrub in the sink before putting them in the fridge or cupboards. I had a face mask I wore for woodworking. I used that mask in the supermarket long before masks became common. Even so, I was still scared. My wife was even more concerned because not only was I outside where the virus was, but I had to actively interact with large groups of people in enclosed spaces. When I got home, I called my wife from the car and had her start a shower that I could immediately enter. Luckily, I live in a rural area with no neighbors or other homes that overlook mine. I stripped at the back door, and my clothes went into a plastic sack to be washed or discarded. My wife locked herself in another room as I ran through the house straight into the shower. Every door and window was open to ventilate any virus I might have brought inside. I had a spare mask in the workshop, so my wife put that on along with some heavy-duty plastic gloves and washed the food while I showered, and then she showered too. The first lockdown was announced the next day. It all seems rather silly now, but back then, it was necessary based on the information we had. I followed all the lockdown protocols strictly. I wore a high filtration mask. I cleaned myself so thoroughly that a surgeon would be proud. Once the fourth national lockdown ended, we visited our daughter, who lives in a different county. I contracted the virus for the first of 3 times during that day trip. It was the first time I had been outside without wearing my mask. That night, I felt unwell, and by lunchtime the next day, I was so ill that I genuinely thought I was going to die. The second time I caught it, it felt like a severe case of flu, and the last time I only experienced a blocked nose and sore throat. I had been vaccinated in between. I thought the vaccine conspiracy theories were quite amusing in some ways. If certain individuals want to track me, they must be very bored. I also understood that some of the guidance we received may later prove to be unnecessary or even incorrect, but it didn't matter. It was all we had to rely on at the time. Story 85. I remembered the inconvenience of the swine flu in 2009 and the images of people wearing masks during the 2002 SARS outbreak. I felt mildly annoyed at the thought of having to be more careful when I traveled. Story 86. I remember sitting down at lunch with my boss and telling him about everything that was happening and asking what we were going to do. He told me leadership had been monitoring the situation but would wait to make any decisions. I laughed and said, "All right, so we'll be working from home next week then?" And we moved on. The next week, we were informed that we would be working from home for 2 weeks. Then it became a month. Then 3 months. Finally, it turned into an indefinite timeline. Honestly, I thought we would all be back after a few months at worst. I had a bidet, so the toilet paper shortage did not affect me. I was just happy to be lazy for a few weeks since my job was quite dependent on being in the office at the time. After we reached the indefinite point, I realized things were not going to return to normal for a while. Story 87. Working at a hotel, the overnight staff member was very invested in conspiracy theories. He kept mentioning the Chinese flu, but I didn't pay much attention. Soon, the guests began to wear masks. Story 88. I was afraid for my family. I thought people would stop arguing over trivial matters and come together to confront the situation. I remember being prepared to take action, not realizing that my role would mean being confined in my small apartment for a few months with nothing but alcohol and negative thoughts for company. Story 89. I thought of a book I read a few years ago titled Spillover by David Quammen. It is a great read for those interested. Story 90. I saw a post about it in December 2019. I was moving away from Denver. Thank goodness I got out of that difficult situation before things went downhill. I remember thinking, I wonder how bad this will be. And then 2020 happened. Story 91. I read a book called The Jakarta Pandemic. I started paying attention to the news reports. When grocery shelves began emptying in Milan, I started buying a little extra every time I went shopping. I wasn't being greedy, but I was preparing. We live in an area that can be hit by hurricanes, so we normally keep a bit of extra food that has a long shelf life and rotate it as we use it. I just made sure to expand that amount. The grocery store rush didn't hit our area for another month or so, and we didn't have to go out during it. Ironically, just before the rush hit us, my wife mentioned that she had just filled the bathroom cabinets with toilet paper, and the storage room was out of toilet paper. I naturally assumed she wanted me to buy more, so I got a large pack. She also bought a large pack on the same day, so we had plenty when the shelves cleared. We have a large extended family. I have 4 sisters and 2 brothers, and she has 2 sisters and 2 brothers. All 4 of our parents were still alive at that time. We have 4 children and 13 grandchildren. We were able to share some supplies with others when needed. Story 92. In January 2020, I got a job at a grocery store. Living in Canada, we didn't hear much news, but in the early days, I remember having a conversation with my roommate about a new illness in China. Customers were on edge about it, but I figured it wouldn't be that big of a deal. We thought it was nothing to worry about. A month later, the toilet paper shortages started. A coworker received a death threat when we began to limit items, and I started to wear a mask earlier than many. I still remember having to show customers my uniform because there were huge lines outside the door, and you could get attacked if they thought you were cutting in line. I know working in a grocery store wasn't nearly as traumatizing as it was for teachers, students, or healthcare workers, but I think I still have some post-traumatic stress disorder. Dealing with customers on edge, yelling all the time, feeling uncomfortable, and being scared when customers refused to wear masks was difficult. I lost two family members directly due to the illness and couldn't attend funerals or be with them in their last moments. Anytime I think about COVID-19, it still makes me stop breathing and creates a pit in my stomach. Had I known what I know now, I would not have taken a job at a grocery store that January. I was lucky to have a job, though. I didn't get caught up in the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, never even applied, and saved a lot of trouble. I did catch the virus once. A roommate infected all of us. He tested incorrectly and thought he was negative until I got sick and tested positive. Then he tested again and he was positive. Story 93. I knew it would be bad since we in America had a difficult president, which we unfortunately still have today. I prepared. I had friends who taught in Hong Kong at the time and informed me that their schools were shutting down in January, and I knew it would eventually shut us all down. I predicted it would be awful, hoping I was wrong. Story 94. At first, there was nothing. When I heard reports of a shutdown, my wife and I picked up a couple of $100s worth of groceries because I figured people would behave irrationally as they had before. I then continued going to work as usual and even traveled more. Story 95. At first, I didn't think much of it. After a few weeks, when it started spreading through the Mediterranean, I began to feel a little worried. Once I saw every band canceling tours, I knew that it would be a while before things returned to normal. Story 96. I was 11 and heard it from a friend randomly during classes. I remember thinking it was either a joke or some kind of little cough, and that it would be forgotten the following year. Story 97. I heard about it in January 2020 on a podcast. It was spreading rapidly across China, and nobody knew what it was. The government was taking it very seriously. There was nothing much to do at that point except keep up with the latest news. Story 98. I am usually the guy who is overly paranoid and worried about these things, but I was in university and working a custodial job in the student union at the time. One day, while I was in the cafeteria area where the TVs were, the news was on. One of my coworkers mentioned her concern that the situation would come here, and I tried to be supportive, but I didn't think much of it myself. I thought, it's across the world, we'll be just fine. I don't know why she's so worried. A few weeks later, I was informed that we were moving to all online classes, and I was unable to continue working that job until things improved. I felt so foolish after that. Story 99. I had heard of it before late February, but during a call with my mom, she updated me while I was starting some weekend errands. As a result, I ended up buying a lot more frozen and shelf-stable food than I had planned. Story 100. I didn't think of it at all. Then came Friday, March 13th, 2020. I worked for a public works department in rural Virginia. I was clearing shrubs when I received a call from my son's preschool that school was closing for 2 weeks. I got in the truck to head back, get my car, and pick up my son. Before I reached our shop half a mile away, I received another call saying all schools were now closed for the rest of the school year. I lost my composure because both his mother and I worked full-time, and he was 10. Babysitting was basically illegal. I ended up taking him to the shop break room that day while we had to close off all parks and public gathering places. I used all my vacation and personal time by only working 3 days per week for months. Story 101. First, I heard about the coronavirus and wondered why people were talking about beer and why it should make me ill, given that it started in China. I have to say that I nearly had no time to read the news during that period. When I understood what it was, I quickly realized that this was something we had discussed as a possibility in 8th grade and hoped that people would take it seriously. I did not expect that there would be effective vaccines developed so quickly to reduce the impact. I just did what I could to protect myself and the people I care about as much as possible and was grateful to be in an environment that handled the situation similarly. Story 102. I became concerned when I saw a couple of articles discussing how COVID-19 impacted people of color more severely. Conveniently, around the same time, some Republicans decided they no longer cared about masking or any other preventative measures. Story 103. It was December 2019, and I decided it was something to monitor, especially having lived in Toronto in 2003 during the SARS outbreak. Story 104. I am worried for my wife, son, and daughter who were on the Vietnam-China border. My daughter secured a new job and managed to catch one of the last flights out of Ho Chi Minh City. Vietnam was much stricter than any other country in the region. Story 105. I remember it like yesterday. One of my students asked me as he was walking out of the classroom door on the Friday of spring break, Mr. Arthur, what do you think about the coronavirus? My response, no big deal. We never returned to school that year, and the next year he was doing school online, so I didn't see him for a year and a half. Story 106. We knew of around 12 older people who mysteriously died from the flu in February and March. That had never happened before, and we were all questioning what was going on. Then COVID-19 was announced and began spreading quickly. It made sense after that. Story 107. I went to a Chinese hot pot restaurant in Irvine, California, not long after COVID-19 started to show up in the news. I remember every other restaurant in the shopping center was busy on a Saturday night except for this one. I mentioned to the waiter that it was emptier than the others, and they said, well, everyone thinks we all have that virus. At the time, I thought it was both funny and sad. A month later, COVID-19 hit Seattle, and everything changed drastically. I remember not being surprised by any of the news of racism or violence against Asian Americans after that, because of the interaction I had with the waiter when COVID-19 was still seen as China's problem. Story 108. This one is different. I started preparing in late December. I gathered some water and non-perishable food. I did not go overboard on toilet paper or sanitizer, just enough. Story 109. In November and December 2019, I saw streamers walking around with masks in China. I figured it was just part of their way of life there and that it was merely a seasonal flu. Story 110. I knew it wasn't going to be short, so school went virtual. Then I went to Florida while attending online classes. Most of the time, I didn't even show up to class. I just completed the assignments. Later that same year, during COVID-19, I realized I was tired of being at home. I wanted to travel, and I enjoyed it. I also got my first tattoo in Florida. Story 111. Like everyone else in northern Italy at the time, we enjoyed canceled work and aperitivo with a spritz in the sun. No one really thought it was significant at first. Story 112. The most interesting thing I read about was a European country that found COVID-19 in sewer samples taken 6 months before the pandemic hit Europe. I tried to follow up on it months later, but it appears that the story was removed. Story 113. Since it was the very early stages, I thought it would probably fizzle out like some other diseases had. Boy, was I wrong. Story 114. I remember when I first came to Canada, I genuinely thought my town was remote enough that it would die out before reaching us. What a fool I was. Story 115. At the time, December 2019 and January 2020, COVID-19 seemed like one of those potential threats similar to Ebola, H1N1, bird flu, or the reappearance of measles or polio. Those diseases had been quarantined and effectively isolated before, and there were other pressing issues to worry about, such as the prospect of Donald Trump's 2020 campaign or the possibility of starting another major conflict in the Middle East. By the time it affected my life, first through the recession it caused, which forced me to change jobs, and then by actually contracting the virus and seeing my partner nearly die, I considered it a genuine threat. The conspiracy theories surrounding vaccinations felt like a profound disservice to the public. Story 116. I didn't think much of it until someone I knew contracted the virus. He is in very good shape and athletic, but it sent him to the hospital. This was early on, around March 2020. Then I started hearing about more and more people getting it everywhere and began to take it seriously. Story 117. I was in a high school microbiology class, and we had to predict how long it would take until it reached pandemic status. I was overly optimistic back then. Story 118. I remember being very paranoid working at Target about catching it. I wore gloves and masks, the whole 9 yards. After 6 months, I was completely over it and ready to get it and get paid. Story 119. Immediately knew it would be used as a political tool. It is unfortunate that people died from it, but the arguments presented by both sides were simply ridiculous. Story 120. Immediate panic. I worked in news when reports began to emerge from China. The moment we had the first case in Georgia, I knew it was going to become serious and frightening quickly. Story 121. I thought it would be contained quickly, but when it started to spread in my area in early March, I knew we were in trouble. Story 122. I was quite naive looking back on it. I was in London when I first heard about a news report regarding a cruise ship that was stranded and unable to dock because many passengers and crew had been infected by a mysterious new virus. That's terrible, I thought. I hope that virus doesn't think it's coming to Britain. Then I got on with my day, totally unaware that the whole world was about to be upended. Story 123. I thought, so this is it. Doctors and public health professionals had been warning that we were overdue for a respiratory pandemic for years. I work with them. Story 124. The thing that still confuses me is the strange early videos from China where people were walking around like zombies. Story 125. When the first cases were reported in October and November, my first thought was that it was going to be a worldwide pandemic. Story 126. I can't remember the first time I heard about COVID-19, but I do remember when I realized I should take it seriously. It was the last week in February when I went to my company's first aid kit for a bandage and noticed that all the alcohol wipes, gloves, and other personal protective equipment had been cleaned out. Pain relievers, bandages, and other basic first aid products were available, but everything in the personal protective equipment category was gone. That weekend, I went grocery shopping and every single store was crowded. It was before any deaths had been announced or lockdowns began, but it was the first time I can recall seeing multiple bare grocery store shelves. The hoarding had begun. That's when I realized it was a significant issue that would affect me. Story 127. I was always at work, but it became tense for everyone because our office is next to a building full of Chinese offshore gambling workers coming and going. Finally, it was announced that we would have to work from home. I was laid off after a month, which was disappointing because I loved my job, and it made me feel depressed, but I still managed to stay sane. Story 128. I was getting ready to retire from the Army Reserves. Completing my bachelor's degrees from home virtually was easy. The best part was when they decided to conduct annual training, and people started getting sick, which was concerning since we were packed in tents like sardines. Ultimately, they canceled the training and sent us home after 5 days. Story 129. My brother's friend Paolo lives in Bergamo, Italy, and was texting about how the hospitals were like battlegrounds and people were falling sick. Atlanta had just played in Spain, and it was believed that the football fans had brought the virus back home with them. That was a few weeks before Christmas, months before the lockdown in the United Kingdom. Paolo was terrified and refused to leave the house at the time. I was worried too and kept an eye on the news for a long time, hoping things would get better. Of course, they didn't. As the government hesitated, we pulled our kids out of school, saying they were both ill. Thankfully, that was 2 weeks before the first lockdown in the United Kingdom. The rest, as they say, is history. Story 130. Biowarfare. Where I work, we began to examine COVID-19 in December 2019. It is a worldwide company, so we started making plans. The initial focal points seemed to be a page taken from a biowarfare planning book, tourist areas with international air travel. One of my managers vacationed in one such location in early December and returned home ill with a virus. Several of us became unwell, but nothing severe. However, 6 weeks later, we were informed that our symptoms were those to monitor for COVID-19. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.